I think we have people still coming in, so let's just maybe give it another minute. Right. Well, let's get going. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Those of you joining us late. My name is Frederick Nabeg. I'm the managing director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. We host our accelerator cohort every year with some of the most promising and innovative medical technology companies from Asia Pacific and beyond. We started this program in January, February, had about 50, 60 companies pitch for us, and the 20 best companies are now in our accelerator. We are live streaming today's webinar on YouTube as well, so a warm welcome to our YouTube viewers. I think we have most of our cohort participants on the webinar now as we speak. So today's topic is a critically important one. We're going to be talking about health economics, reimbursement, and communicating value. We have an outstanding panel today with two experts in this area. They'll introduce themselves in just a moment. We are fortunate to have Anand Jha, founder and managing director at Ansia Consulting, and he'll give you the details of his background and the work that he's doing in health economics and market access. We're also very pleased to welcome Dr. Yvonne Lee from Johnson & Johnson. She is Director, Health Economics and Market Access Asia Pacific within J&J's Cardiovascular Specialty Solutions group. So I'll turn to our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Tell us a bit about your background specifically in health economics and market access, and briefly about your organization. And maybe ladies first, so I will start with Yvonne.
Thank you, Frederick. I'm thrilled to be part of the panelists, and I am very new to J&J organizations. I'm 3 months old in the company, but in terms of being in the industry, working on health economic and market access, it's over 10 years now. So I started my career like everyone else as a fresh graduate working in genetic epidemiology in the US. I had a opportunity to further on my studies in public health. That's where I further expanded my skill into doing epidemiology. And I still find that I'm not getting it there. I really want to be closer to the patients and making an impact. That's how I had the opportunity to start my career in health economic and market access with Pfizer. I had a solid training with Pfizer on how do we bring a product from the R&D lab all the way to regulatory and ensuring patients have access to the therapies. That's what intrigued me to continue to stay in this field, as with the latest technology, it's evolving at a very quick pace, especially in medical device space. We see iterations of new generations of a device every 2 years, every 3 years. It doesn't stop there. With the changing external environment, we have to keep up with that pace as well. A little background of Johnson & Johnson. Within the medical device business areas, we have the general surgery, the orthopedics, and I work in a cardiovascular space. It's a very busy and exciting area for all of us in this market access space.
Great, thanks very much for that, Yvonne. And I believe you also spent time with Boston Scientific and a few other major multinationals, right?
That's right. A short stint at Boston Scientific and the regional Asia Pacific role as well for about 2 years, and then I moved on to Terumo to set up the market access function in Asia Pacific in the last 4 years. Yeah.
Good. So great background in market access and health economics. And of course, so does Anand. So tell us a bit about yourself and your organization, Anand.
Very good morning again, and good morning to all the companies who have dialed in. And thanks again for inviting me as a panelist. So my background, I've been in the healthcare industry for 22 years plus. It's a mixture of medical devices and pharma. In medical devices, I worked with Edwards Life Sciences for a couple of years, doing strategic planning and access. And my experience has been a mixture of functional, health economics, pricing, reimbursement, as well as general management as well. So in terms of pricing and access and health economics, I spent a lot of time with Novartis in the global head office in global pricing and access in Basel, where I was looking at the access strategies of the different new products to be coming in, what should be the way of go-to-market for these products. And then I spent time with Alcon in my last industry role. I was the pricing, access, and government affairs lead for Asia PAC. And there we were looking at how to bring the new technologies into the market, right from what is the right messaging, how to communicate the value, and also understanding, in order to look at the innovation, it's not just the final product. When the final product comes in, you have to understand the whole journey, not only the patient, but also the surgeon. What is it that the surgeon does? So that is also something I'm sure the companies over here would have looked at when you're looking at what are the unmet needs where you can add value. So after that, for the last 5 years, I've been the founder and the MD of NCR Consulting. So we work again both with pharma and medical device companies for their access challenges, getting the new technology into the market, the right value messaging. We've done some work in vitro diagnostics, in devices, HTA submissions, organizing, looking at the global models, customizing it for the countries, working with the payers, policy shaping, and so on. I'm happy to be over here to address some of the questions and hopefully share some of my experience.
Terrific. Thank you. Great to have both of you here. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule today. So maybe let's begin at a relatively high level here, and then we'll get a lot more. We'll get into the details very quickly. Broadly, we're now sort of in a post-pandemic area here in Asia Pacific. What are some of the key trends that you are seeing in the Asia Pacific reimbursement and environment? And Yvonne, maybe I'll start with you on this.
I think budget constraint is one of the biggest thing in payers' mind across any countries in Asia Pacific. With that in mind, they have to prioritize what is the necessary spending. How much should we spend on drugs? How much should we spend on infrastructure and the rest of the things to mitigate the post-COVID environment as well? So with that, I think the most crucial thing that we have to be very conscious of is when we bring a new product to a payer for reimbursement, what is the differentiating value? What are the value that we are bringing to our payers saying that you need to reimburse this new technology because of XYZ reason? Not just on the clinical evidence side, but a lot of time right now, payer would want to see the economic evidence as well. What is our economic arguments? Should we invest in this new high price technology? Does this cost outweigh the outcomes or the benefits that this new technology brings to our patients? I think that it's what we are seeing. And from the industry, from the commercial side, we always ask, do we have sufficient evidence? Do we have relevant evidence? And with that, countries in Asia Pacific are following trend, especially Southeast Asia, are looking up to the mature markets in APAC, for example, South Korea, Japan, Australia. They are very stringent with the evidence requirement for reimbursement. It's beyond just a checkbox that we do for regulatory. They need local evidence that they are looking for now. They are okay with accepting US outside of Asia Pacific evidence from the Europe, but one question always in the back of their mind: how does our population looks like? Similarities, differences. Even though a lot of time when we look at the patient's prognosis, we postulate that you would not have huge variation. They still demand that we need local data. We need to see how our population behave. Yeah.
Good point. We'll talk more about evidence a little bit later. Anand, at a very high level, key trends in APAC reimbursement from your perspective.
So I think what you all mentioned is very true in terms of the need for the evidence as well as the budget controls. But a few positive things have also happened with the COVID. You know, as people have been more used to working remotely, even you know, getting their treatments or prescriptions or diagnosis remotely. We have seen that telemedicine has come up a lot, where some of the countries are also being able to reimburse. Again, the more developed countries are out there, Australia, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan a little bit, to reimburse telemedicine. And what we are also seeing in terms of post-COVID or driven by COVID, remote patient care, you know, that is something that has come up where it was there before, but COVID actually has accelerated some of these dynamics, which were, I would say, has been multiplied 5 or 7 times as compared to what all the companies and the systems were looking at for adoption of the new technologies. So it's a positive thing, I would say, and driven by COVID.
Yeah.
One more thing I would say is that in terms of some of the companies that we work with, moving from stuff around new technology, which enables doctors and nurses, that also we see as patients are coming into back to the hospitals, the technology adoption, which has kind of got a halo effect on other technologies. Also, adoption has been faster than it was before COVID, even if it is not about remote monitoring.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. We typically ask our panelists at what point, when you see startup companies and you work with startup companies, what point in time should they start to think about their health economic narrative and their reimbursement strategy, and at what point in time, in your view, should a startup consider appointing an external expert in this area? Because very often the founding team within a medical technology startup is unlikely to have a health economic expert. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen it in the founding team. So when do they need to start thinking about this? When does it make sense for them to bring in an external expert? And Anand, maybe I'll turn to you first.
So a few years ago, I would say, look, don't think about health economics for now. Focus on your commercial model and then go to market strategy. And then we'll bother about this later. It has not changed substantially, I would say, but the tech terms, when you're looking at the investors, when you're talking about your aspiration and the vision that you are going to expand beyond the private payers or some of the private hospitals or self-payers, depending upon whoever is your customer, beyond further to getting funding and reimbursement, I think it's important to know this the different terminologies, understand how the system works, how you can grow, what is your growth story. So understand all this. But in terms of appointing someone and looking at more into the health economic aspects, I would still say the first thing is to make sure that you have a good go-to-market strategy. I'll be happy because working in health economics and access area to support, but I've also been a commercial leader in the past. So I would say focus on your commercial piece, look at what are I would say evidence and unmet need is much more important to what you was saying before. But health economic per se, dossier submissions and other pieces is good to know the terminologies and good to understand how the systems work. But having an expert or appointing someone within the team, I think it still would be a bit later once your product is into the market. You won't need it immediately. That's what I would say.
So are you saying that a startup company could wait as long as launch and commercialization and regulatory approval to start thinking about this? Is that
No, thinking about it earlier as well. You should definitely think about it and understand how the systems work. But I was looking at the second part, when you appoint an external or an internal expert within the team, or engage an expert externally. I think that is something which, when you're going in for the submission, then you need. But starting thinking about it, absolutely, you should know how the things work.
Yeah. Good point. Yvonne, let's talk a little bit more about reimbursement specifically in Asia Pacific. I think certainly our cohort audience have a good understanding of it, but it might just be useful to recap which are the major markets in Asia Pacific that are reimbursed, that are co-pay, that are out of pocket. And in your experience with the different multinationals you've been working with, how does the local reimbursement environment on the ground affect your market launch priorities, Yvonne?
This is something, it's an ongoing activities that I do regardless of which multinational company I'm with. It's always to educate global teams or outside of Asia Pacific team that you can't see Asia Pacific as one country. Each country, it's very diverse, has very different healthcare system. I think first thing, if I could advise, is learn about the healthcare system of the market that you want to launch your product. I'll take China, for example. You think that China is a country by itself, a market by itself. But if you were to go and analyze how reimbursement works, for medical device, there isn't a national reimbursement process that you can put through for medical device. Unlike pharmaceuticals, there is a transparency there. So for China, you have the province, you have the state level, then you have the county level. Each province works differently from one to another. So when I look at the number of provinces in China, that I would see it as the number of country equivalents in China. Each province has their own legislations and regulations on how they want to reimburse a product. So with that in mind, you would need to study how would one put through a applications to get the reimbursement. That is just for China. And then if we will move to Australia, South Korea, and Taiwan, there is a much structured process to get your application through for a medical device to be reimbursed. So when we talk about reimbursement for medical device, it's slightly different from drugs. Drugs, you just have an application you put in based on the mechanism of action, and that is it. But for medical device, you may have the capital equipment. You might have the disposable of single-use device that patient would use in each procedure, and then you might have other ancillary costs that you would need to be covered for this procedure alone. So when you think about reimbursement, we need to study each of the country regulations. What are the requirements? Do they have a bundle or sort of DRG system to pay for a procedure? Australia runs on a DRG. DRG is diagnosis-related group. So if a patient has been diagnosed for these medical conditions, they would be reimbursed at X amount of dollar for all the procedures related to treat this medical condition. So with that category, for Australia, they would cover for the procedure, the single-use device, hospital stay, technicians and labor costs and whatever you have in that single item. Very similar structure for South Korea and Taiwan as well. You would have that reimbursement. So for a new device to come to the market, you would need to first find out and assess, do we have a category for this procedure? If there isn't, then you would need to create a new category for that. And then we switch gear and we go down to Southeast Asia. That's another maze that we have to go through. There isn't a standardized processes. And in Southeast Asia, some of the countries are out of pocket as well. That you still have a public system. For example, in Malaysia, 80 to 90% a public system, but you still have a good amount of cohort or population that can afford private treatment. So in that case, for private sectors, they also look up to the public health system. Is the device reimbursed and used in the public settings? If it's not, they sometimes would be reluctant unless the physicians or the KOL, key opinion leader, are early adopters. They want to take this in and try it out for experience and drive the innovations in their hospital. So let's say it's a truly, if I could put it, I would call it a jungle within Asia Pacific. It's so much going on and changes. We hardly can keep up with the changes of policy change in each of the countries. Yeah. So it's very different.
Yeah,
There's no one size fit all.
Thanks, Yvonne. Well, for our cohort and our listeners here, don't despair. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, they do.
There is a pathway. And Anand, let me turn to you for a second. If you work with smaller companies, do you advise them in terms of their launch sequence to maybe focus on, let's go for the out-of-pocket markets first? You don't have to get reimbursement, quicker pathway to revenue, or is it better to go for to do the work, the homework, get the product reimbursed and go to the reimbursed markets where potentially the opportunity is much bigger? How do you normally guide your clients on those types of questions?
So I think in this one, whether it is the big companies or the smaller one, and pharma, or where the reimbursement is much more defined, or also the big device companies, most of the time, even for a reimbursed country, the launch happens in the private setting. You also sometimes provide experience while you are preparing for the reimbursement and negotiations. Because once you get the local FDA approval, local regulatory approval, you can launch, whether it's a drug or the device, in the market. And you are preparing for the discussion with the payers. It hardly happens that you launch and immediately you are reimbursed, because there is a process, there is time needed. So it's always the self-payers. In some of the instances, the patients are not used to, especially when the government says, look guys, we've got you covered. So the private market is less, but with the copay coming in, more and more, I would say, patient groups are used to having copays. An example is Taiwan, where now we are looking at advising some of the companies between registration and reimbursement. The gap has been increasing, what to do for the self-pay segment. So especially for the startup companies, when you're looking at going in for the markets where you have reimbursement, there are private payers, not only self-pays, but also hospital groups. When you have to look at some of the pieces that when you engage with the let's say the payers, it may not be an HTA process or a health economic process, but you have to justify the value that you're bringing in. So I would say, depending upon what you are offering, and you will have to do, first of all, which markets you are targeting. That's the first sequence. Depending upon the markets you are targeting, what kind of market types out there are, as Evan was telling, there is from self-pay to fully reimbursed. And one more interesting thing that one has to see is, even if there is a DRG or there is a group or the therapeutic group that is paid for, in some of the countries, patients are allowed to top up from whatever is the value in the DRG. In some of the countries, they are not. So if you are in Korea, for example, in some of the instances, this is the amount of money that the government gives and you pay your copay, you are not able to top up if you want a specific device to be included or to be implanted. Similarly, Taiwan as well. So you have to look at the second level details when you're going in for the reimbursed markets. But my advice as to your question is, look at before looking at preparing for the reimbursement dossier and the whole process, the self-pay segment, the private hospital and the funder segment, understand their needs, what they're looking for, and then move into the whole technical process of getting funding and reimbursement.
Right. Thanks for that, Anand. Today's conversation is going to be primarily on Asia Pacific, but I did want to just ask about some of the high level differences between APAC and the US, and maybe I'll stay with Anand to get your views on this first. what are some of those key differences that a startup company here in the region needs to be aware of? Maybe in differences between what is coverage, what is reimbursement. We're not going to go into the US in detail, but could you just give us sort of in a couple of sentences what the key differences might be?
So in the US, normally there are certain rules. There is this Medicare national maximum payment amount, and then you have to work with the hospitals. They are getting a specific amount, and there's a predetermined fee schedule. So things are, I would say, more laid out. And many of the times when I was having discussions with our global team and most of the device companies, US is the biggest market. So it's about, can we get the right code? What is the right code? Or what is the best code that we get? And can we create the code for reimbursement? So it's very important for you to justify why you should be paid under a specific code. So which is for the reimbursed markets here also kind of similar on which kind of DRG code you apply. So there are some similarities in that sense, but I think in the US it's much more formalized, where you are looking at how you are able to get the right reimbursement. And then the manufacturers create a value proposition for the device, and then look at some of the, I would say, with the providers, what kind of special discounts you can provide to them. So a lot of the thing is about what tier you are coming into the system, what discounts you're offering. So that is something that defines more on the US dynamic. And of course, Asia Pacific, some markets do mimic or start to mimic what we have over there, but here it's much more complex, I would say. Smaller market, much more complex.
Given the heterogeneity of the region, of course. Yvonne, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about pricing and government price regulations specifically. And what does a medical technology startup need to know about government price regulations here in the region? I know in Japan you have things like foreign reference pricing, and in Australia you got the prosthesis list. You got price caps in India. Tell us a little bit about some of those challenges and what might be useful to know if you're a startup with maybe 6 to 18 months to launch.
I think the first thing, if going back to the earlier questions, when should we think about market access reimbursement strategy? If we don't have the bandwidth in time to launch, you definitely need a pricing expert because of how things are priced here. I would strongly advise to run a comprehensive pricing analysis of your competitors, what is available in the market and how is it being reimbursed. So I take Japan pricing regulations that is a very hot discussion these days. So Japan do a foreign reference pricing for bringing in your new technology when they want to reimburse that procedure or the device. 5 countries that they would look at is UK, Germany, Australia, Italy, and France. And if you're going to launch a product in EMEA first, make sure that you really look into the price that you're going to set up in EMEA countries, because that would affect how Japan would be pricing or will be reimbursing your device. So if you set it too low in EMEA, and when Japan reference those pricing, there's no adjustment that you can make, right? So you already missed the boat of pricing correctly for value of your product that you bring to the market. And
sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
If I have not launched in Europe and I go to Japan first, what do they do then?
They would look at precedence pricing. Is it a Me Too product that we are bringing in, or is it a novel product?
Okay.
Any similarities in the category of the product features, then that they would refer to. If there's none, then you are in a good position to price based on value that you're bringing in for your device. And also bear in mind that Japan runs a repricing every 2 years, that they will readjust the price or reimbursement rate of the product. So if we
it's never up, right? It's always down.
Yes, and
as far as I understand.
Yes, There's also a category, we call it a challenge applications or innovative device that you could put through. That category, if you get your device into that category, it would never be affected by the every biannually repricing that they're doing. So you're safe in that category. But if you're not in an innovative sort of category when you first put in your product, then you're at risk of price adjustment every 2 years. Yeah. So for Australia, prosthesis lease is the private market in Australia. So they have a recent reform where they are regrouping all the devices, the procedures to ensure that they are being, I call it a spring cleaning, because they have never looked into what they reimburse. So every company would just submit an application, they just add it on, and you have a long laundry list of things. So in the last year, they are regrouping some of the entire prosthesis list to ensure that the procedures are grouped into the right therapeutic areas. And in terms of pricing, for Australia prosthesis list, we have not get to it there yet. They have just launched a public consultations last 2 months, and to ensure that manufacturers are in alignment and agree with such a grouping before they talk about is there any change in the reimbursement rates for that category, for example. Yeah, and pricing, it's if you don't have a market access person yet, definitely invest in a pricing expert and do it before your launch as early as you can, so you get a pricing analysis of the market that you want to launch and to ensure that there's no price erosion down the line and how you protect your price as time moves on.
That's great advice, Sidvan. Thanks. Anand, do
Maybe
you want to add
Frederick,
to this
just
as well, please?
yeah, just one thing on Japan, because I saw Janelle Low was asking a couple of questions about Japan. So in terms of, as Ewan was saying, there is the price referencing to some of the other countries unless you are in an innovative category. One of the things also is a lot is about establishing that there is no competitor. So your product is something which is having no competitor. Then you have something called cost plus pricing. And many of the time, what the authorities have been seeing is cost is the cost at which the product lands in the country. So then you look at the transfer price plus a premium over there. So that is also something where some of the companies have been doing that. If there is no competitor per se, then it's cost plus. And a lot of the discussion is about establishing why you are unique and different and should not be looked at for the comparator.
Right.
That's one
Then,
thing.
excuse me. Then, of course, we have the price caps in India. What is the status there, Anand?
So the status keeps on changing. There is the squeeze is coming in, and then there's, as a few years ago, they've been especially the cardiac implants, some of the stents, price control. Then the discussion has been about for the knee replacement, what can be done for the other categories. So it is a reality where slowly we see that different medical devices are coming under price control in India. What I see and the industry has done well is talking about the markups in the overall in the chain.
Yeah.
Because many of the times it is the markup and the I would say members or the distributors, sometimes the providers that have been adding the markup. So that's why the price control, I think it has started to we are not yet there, but the discussion that I've been involved, some of the government, I would say price regulators have been much more open to say, yes, we understand that there should be a margin control versus a final price control. So that is happening. But I think India, especially now with this Make in India initiative, which is happening, it'll become more and more difficult. And the dependence of India, where the majority of the devices are imported, that there would be a price, I would say reduction of the price corridor between the local products and the imported products, and it's not going to be local products being priced higher.
Mm.
The imported products will be having continued price pressure.
Right. Because I remember a few years ago when they started this, I think the price reduction on coronary stents was in the order of about 80% of imported stents. It was to the point where some multinationals just decided to pack it in and exit the market. So that can of course happen as well. Anand spoke about distributors and role of distributors, and let me turn to Yvonne here for a minute. What role do you see local distributors play in navigating reimbursement challenges? And for a smaller company that may not have the direct sales force that J&J has, that would have to work through a distributor, can they make the application on behalf of the manufacturer? Do they understand this environment well enough? Typically, what role do you see they take here?
Going back to my previous company, the business model in some of the smaller markets, we leverage distributor,
right,
to run the business locally. So one thing with distributor, if you have performed a comprehensive assessment of the distributor company, you would get a sense whether they have any experience with reimbursement market, submissions, payer negotiations. So for South Korea, the distributor that we worked in my previous role, they would run the submissions or the business as if they are part of the company.
Okay.
Yep. So they would also connect with payer. South Korea would be the HERA, the HTA agency, to connect with them, understanding what are the requirements. This is what we have. Is it sufficient to put through a reimbursement, and what is the possibility of success with the existing evidence that we have? So I think distributor model is an option when you are starting up, and with the change of the environment, they are getting better and better. Some bigger distributor company even have their own sales force that you could leverage on. But one of the catch would be, are they carrying your competitor product? So that is something to take note of. Then they might have conflict of interest. For example, the distributor will be going to a key account, which is in hospital. We always ask ourselves, is the distributor carry our competitor product? Which one would you promote? Would you promote one that give you bigger volume? And sometimes it's very hard to dictate what is the outcome. So that is something to take note of when we select a distributor for our product.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, and that's an issue whether you're discussing reimbursement or not. I believe as you develop your commercial strategy, we will touch on that. In fact, on a separate webinar where we talk about go-to-market strategies and commercialization. Let's talk a little bit about health technology assessment. You both mentioned it. I'm not sure everyone on this webinar fully understands what it is, and maybe I'll turn to Anand first. What is HTA, and which markets in Asia Pacific have HTA agencies?
So HTA simply is health technology assessment. It is about as the systems evolved, governments were saying, okay, we are spending money on healthcare. Is it worth it? So that's how the HTA agencies were born in a way. In this part of the world, Australia has been the first one, which had PBAC, which was established more than 30 years ago. And at that time, the question was always, can we look at two aspects? The clinical value that is being provided by the product, and the quality of life, is it being improved or not? So there is some of the companies would have heard of things like quality adjusted life years and cost per quality. So when you look at what is the cost per quality adjusted life year, that establishes what is called one of the thresholds, which the governments or the advisors or the HTA bodies say, look, we have looked at what kind of cost or investment we are doing in this technology versus a current standard of care. If there is a standard of care, which is a comparator, or if it is though there is no treatment, or there is no, in the case of the drug, any drug available, then they look at what is being done in terms of the best supportive care. So what is the comparator? What is the investment we are doing in that comparator or competing technology, and the benefits that we are getting there versus when we are evaluating a new technology. So this is, the HTA bodies have been doing this assessment. When you look at the HTA bodies here in this part of the world, it is, Australia, Korea that do a pure full HTA assessment of the cost effectiveness. You have Taiwan as well, where the cost effectiveness is not done, but you can submit it from your end as proactively. Singapore, of course, ACE was established recently, which has been kind of mimicking what has been done in Australia with a full cost effectiveness analysis, budget impact model that is there. Now, there are other countries, for example, Thailand has HITAP. When you are going through a specific pathway, when the government will be reimbursing your product, then you go through a HITAP assessment as well, which does the same HTA assessment. Then there are other countries which are talking about it, or they said they will be implementing HTAs. For example, Philippines, they have got a regulation where they say whatever NICE has been doing in the UK, we'll be using that as an approach. Vietnam also is talking about it. But what I see is that beyond the Australia, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the other countries which are there in this part of the world, in Asia Pac, they talk about health economics and HTA. India has been looking a little bit, but ultimately, if they are not paying for the treatment, HTA is a moot point. And the capacity of and the capability of the system to evaluate these dossiers is very limited. So that's where I would say that capacity building, first the governments have to do before they start doing the HTA assessments. But beyond these 4 countries, there are others are more in the pathway to adopting HTA-based decision making.
Right. Closely linked, of course, to HTAs is, and we spoke about this briefly, is the whole aspect of communicating the value of your innovation. And Yvonne, when a startup has developed or is in the process of developing an innovation, how would that company know what evidence might be required to satisfy payers, to satisfy the HTAs, and how it's a question we very often get. How from startup ventures, how do I demonstrate the value of my innovation? And that's a huge question, of course, and we can talk for hours about that. But if you were to summarize a few key points, what are some of the things companies should keep in mind?
I think the very first one is an unmet need within the therapeutic area that you are targeting. That is the big questions, and easy to target if we know when we develop devices to address those unmet needs. With that in mind, it's very natural that you would think of, how do I demonstrate this unmet need? That's where all the evidence would come in. Then we want to think about evidence generations. Are we, with this new device that you're bringing into the market, is it going to improve any clinical outcomes or patient outcome? That is the key to thing that you think I would suggest that everyone to think about when you're developing a device to address an unmet need. In terms of HTA applications, it's a very similar format that in a traditional HTA application, regardless of which countries that you would plan to submit, they always start with unmet medical needs. How does your product fit into the current treatment algorithm? Is it going to improve the clinical outcomes? Or, for example, you have a Me Too devices that may not be novel. You have something in the market, but probably a special niche cohort of patients that do not tolerate the current treatment might have a huge adverse event. That's where you could position your device that you could address this unmet. Then you would want to, as Anand alluded to, some of the mature markets would want to see the cost. In the health economic analysis or evaluation, we have this 4 quadrants that we will plot in. So we have the first top quadrant on your left would be it's expensive. You have 2 axes, which is price and outcomes benefits. A lot of players would want to see that the price would be would not outweigh too much of the clinical outcomes. Does that mean that they would not invest? No. As long as we could demonstrate the unmet need, government are willing to invest. For example, oncology drugs, which is very expensive for each treatment cycle. It could cost you a cycle of probably $10,000 and you need 6 cycles, $60,000. You would think that a government would be reluctant to invest, but as long as you could provide the justifications of this new technology, new mechanism of actions, we are addressing unmet needs, that's where the cost argument could come in and say, yes, you're paying more expensive, but you are improving quality of life of the patients, you're prolonging survival, for example, if you're talking oncology. From the patient perspective, what are we doing with the new technology? I think that would be key to success. I think that would be a key ingredient.
Good point. Thanks for that. And related to that, Anand, how does a startup company know what evidence is required, what data is needed? Can they approach the HTA agencies and simply ask the question and have a conversation with government bodies about what exactly they require for their particular innovation? How does that process work practically on the ground?
So in fact, these HTA bodies, unlike what you would think that they would say, don't talk to us and close doors, they're very open in terms of having inviting companies also sometimes to say, look, please come in and ask questions with us. And of course, PBAC, and I should correct myself, it was established in 1953. It was the very first one before worldwide, actually, before other HTA bodies were established. So during my time, this was the pharma days, we were looking at something called early direct payer engagement, where we were asking the HTA bodies, that was NICE, PBAC, IQWiG as well, to see what kind of trials we should have, because we don't want to end up coming to you with evidence which you don't need. So it's always very important to understand what they are looking for, the voice of the payer, voice of the customer. When you look at the KOL perspective, which most of us know of, but it's about the payer, because end of the day, if you are generating some evidence, it's much longer and costlier for a pharma versus a device. But it's always important to understand what they are looking for, what they would reimburse. You've seen some examples and precedences that what they have reimbursed that you would see of the similar kind of technologies in the market. But it's always good to see if you are coming up with something which you don't see any direct competitor and you are coming up with something unique. Always ask them first, and they are very open. And believe me, I was also having the same impression a few years ago or 10 years ago. How can I ask them what you're looking for? We have to propose to them, but it's not the case. Always reach out. And it's not only for the government HTA bodies, any of the funders, they would be very open to, if you go there and say, look, we want to make sure that you spend your money properly. So we want to show you the evidence that you're looking for.
That's really important advice. Thanks for that, Anand. Really appreciate that. I'm conscious of the fact that we probably only have about 11 or 12 minutes left. I did want to very briefly, maybe I'll turn to Yvonne here, get your maybe a very brief description of value-based healthcare. It's one of those buzzwords that I think people hear a lot of and are wondering what is it? Is it even relevant in Asia Pacific? Should I, as a medical technology startup company, even think about value-based healthcare, or is that something for for markets outside of APAC? Where do we stand at the moment here in the region?
I think we have progressed from, if I would say, probably 5-6 years now. It's no longer a buzzword in Asia Pacific. You'll see some of the countries are adopting value-based healthcare. So when we said about value-based, it's going back to the investment of the cost. Does the investment or high-price device outweigh the sorry, it's the other way around. Does the clinical benefits of this new devices that outweigh the high-cost device that we are bringing into the market? So it's, if I could put it in a simple manner, it's how do we pay for these new devices, which is very costly? What is the value in terms of clinical outcomes, clinical differentiations compared to existing technology that we have? So the one way to do it, it's in terms of payment of this new technology. So that's where you would negotiate with the payer. So Australia, very good and value-based agreement. So for example, you bring a new technology into the market. You might not have all the clinical evidence that you have when the government wants to, or the payer wants to reimburse your product. So we have data uncertainty. So with that, Australia would say, okay, there is a huge unmet need. Let's bring in the new innovations, the new product to the market, to Australia. We will monitor for 2 years. So then there will be agreement on how we want to pay for the product. Do we want to pay based on outcome? Do we want to pay based on certain number of populations that will have early access? With that, if we're going to pay by outcome, for example, in an oncology drug that we say, this will prolong survival years from the existing current treatment of 2 years that we have, the new treatment will bring you a 5 years. So we will follow up the patient for 5 years, giving the early access to the patients. By the end of 5 years, the patients that have access to this new technology, do they really survive for 5 years? If they do, Australia payer would pay for the drugs as per the price that they've early negotiated when they bring in the new technology. If it doesn't meet the evidence that they agree earlier on, then probably that would be the adjustment of the pricing then. That's how one way to do it. So it's a way from the government to not only control the budget, but they know what are they paying for such an investment. And there's a lot of ways that they can do a value base. It could be outcome, it could be discount, but there would be some sort of an agreement in place. But definitely value-based healthcare is here in Asia Pacific.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Yvonne. Anand, anything you want to add on that note? You're on mute.
No, I think Yvonne pretty much covered most of the things that are there, so nothing very different.
Good. So maybe in the last few minutes we have, Anand, I wanted to get your perspective on digital health reimbursement in Asia Pacific. How is obtaining reimbursement for a digital health innovation different from getting it for a traditional medical device, and what have been some of the recent developments here in the region?
So what I see is, as I was telling in the very beginning, COVID actually has been helpful for not only adoption of Zoom by the companies, but also the patients looking at telemedicine and then the systems paying for it. Now in digital health, there are different components. You have software as a medical device, you've got remote monitoring, you've got telemedicine, and multiple aspects, which robotic surgery again is something which is more on the digital health side. So what we are seeing is that globally there has been more and more people or the companies are getting reimbursed for things like apps. An example which I was sharing with you before was an app called Inverto, which is in Germany. It is an app where patients typically for anxiety and mental health, they wear a VR glass, and then you can walk around. It can be reimbursed as well. So more and more of these kind of apps are coming in, and I understand there would be a couple of, at least one of the companies which has having an app-based product.
That's right.
So
In mental health even. So yes.
in mental health even. So I would recommend they look at this company, and
Yeah.
we can cover it separately. So again, it is about working. This time it is working with the payers to get the funding, because many of the times it's about the national funding. If you get the national funding, it's much easier. And B2B, as you all would know, is easier than B2C. B2C takes much more time for individuals to pay for their treatment and all. But if it is coming from the doctor, because doctor would recommend if there is some kind of funding available or the insurance coverage is over there. So that's what we see more and more, that companies which are having even digital health products, they are seeing, can this be a prescribed, even if it is not a prescription thing, can a clinician advise this, versus them trying to do something like an Apple or a Fitbit to go to the consumers directly. So that is something that we are seeing, and examples, again, the more advanced countries. Korea has been, I would say, much ahead as compared to Australia, even in terms of the digital health reimbursements that we see. So then Taiwan, Australia, as I was talking about, these are the three countries which are more advanced in the area. But I would say if you are coming up with a digital health kind of a product looking for reimbursement, the environment is becoming more positive and more receptive for reimbursing these technologies.
And I saw we had a question here about artificial intelligence. If your core innovation is AI, does that get reimbursed? Are there any examples of that, and is the pathway similar to other digital health technologies?
They maybe. I have to look into it. Personally, I have not encountered. I have seen some of the image reading kind of apps, especially the diagnostics companies are looking at, when you have the scans, when you have the images, especially some of the cancer detection. So that's what I've seen as products coming in. I haven't seen systems reimbursing. Even you have reimbursement challenges for NGS testing when you have the targeted therapies, which is more of diagnostics. So there are some of the countries which are moving forward, but I haven't seen in our part of the world an AI driven solution being reimbursed. I don't know if you would be aware of, but at least I haven't seen it.
Okay.
Not in this region.
Well, it's probably just a matter of time. Thanks for that. Quick reminder to our cohort, stay on, of course, for our Q&A for the next 30 minutes, and do put your questions into the Q&A box here at the bottom of your screen, or later just raise your hand, and we'll address those in just a moment. So we could have gone on here on some of these topics for quite a while. I really appreciate your time. Before we part ways with our YouTube audience and go into our Q&A, maybe I'll ask each of you to maybe give some final words of advice, tips to smaller companies that are grappling with some of the reimbursement and health economic challenges, and also perhaps if you are open to give your contact details, maybe you can just put them into the chat if they'd like to reach out to you after this webinar. So Yvonne, I'll turn to you first. Any parting words, final tips or advice?
I cannot stress how important to have market access capabilities. Even at a startup company, you don't need a team of 5, but at least you need one person, not just to generate health economics arguments or evidence, but thinking about market access strategy before or in line with your regulatory strategy. I think that would be the key success, because when you're running a reimbursement applications, whatever that you put on your label may affect your reimbursement application. So I would always suggest to start market access strategy as early as you would do with regulatory strategy as well. One key takeaway is you really need to understand the current market access environment in the country that you would want to launch. What are the assessment criteria? The second key takeaway is, if you look at the health ecosystem and the product where it would be fit in, do a mapping of all the stakeholders that would be involved. Could be a user, could be a patient. Get the perspective and where would this product fit into the treatment algorithm moving on. I think that would be key.
Great advice, and certainly stakeholder mapping is always immensely helpful, especially if you're a startup venture. Thanks so much for that, Yvonne. Yeah. Anand.
So at this time, what Yvonne was saying, similar to that, make sure that you have an understanding of the health systems. And there I would say is also understand how the funding flow happens in the system. Mm-hmm. So stakeholders are important, but how the money flows, because in our markets or in Asia PAC, it's not just central government that is giving the reimbursement. How does the funding flows, and can you tap into those sources of funding, and who are the budget holders at that pathway of funding flows? So that is very important to understand. And you may not need a health economist, as I was saying before, but understanding of the pricing strategy, the access strategy. And access strategy is not about health economics, because many of the times people use interchangeably. Health economics, we need a health economics person, but it's about the access strategy, which is more commercial. And I would say your commercial strategy and access strategy has to be one, or has to be interlinked. Access doesn't come later. Access is when you're getting paid for the value that you are delivering. So that is very important. And the healthcare system. The last thing I will add is, the policies which are there or coming up, you might want to see if there is what has been happening, and if you can piggyback on understanding how the policy is shaping up, because that will drive a lot how your uptake happens in the reimbursed market, especially.
Great advice. Thank you so much, both Yvonne and Anand, for joining us today. It's been a terrific discussion. I certainly learned a lot. Don't hang up. We will continue in just a moment with a Q&A. So our cohort as well. Do stay on the line. Thank you to those of you who've been watching this on YouTube. We'll be back same time, same channel next week. And I believe next week's topic is intellectual property management. So you don't want to miss that. So thanks, everyone. And further